Hello, this is Business Agility Live. My name is Mike Leber. I'm your host today, and with us today is James Priest. And James is the co-author and co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0. And it's a real pleasure having you, James, today at our show. Welcome, James. James, can you hear us?
Thank you, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
All right. There is a little delay, and I think I'm gonna maybe explain a little bit because my connection might be more, let's say, powered than yours. So first of all, James, who is from the UK, lives in Barcelona, and he doesn't only live in a flat, but he actually lives on a boat. So he lives on a boat in the marina or in the harbor. You might tell us more where the boat actually currently lies. But this means two things. Your connectivity, as per video, is maybe a little bit lower in terms of bandwidth than ours, which is no problem. And second, I think it's quite hot on your boat these days, and at the moment, especially as you have electricity outages.
That's right. Yeah, so we're navigating via tension here. Actually, the electric's just come back on, but it is a bit unpredictable here in the marina. And it's, I don't know, 27 or so outside today. So if the electric cuts again, then I warm up very quickly. And we're also on a sim here. There's no Ethernet. And it's one of the challenges we have to navigate if you're working from home.
Yeah. No problem. And, you know, it's about business agility. It's about agility as such. And how could we not just deal with these things, which are not exactly going the way they always went or planned or anything? So as you just said, I mean, basically going via drivers and basically letting the conversation emerge. I think that's what it's all about. First of all, James, maybe start with a little introduction. The topic as such is super interesting today, but maybe you can give us a little bit of your background, and that means you probably have to be short because you have a lot of background. I mean, first of all, you come from the sociocracy field. I think you're a long-term sociocracy practitioner, and then came a lot of other things. Maybe you can give us a little introduction because there might be some listeners who don't know you yet.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0, along with Lily David and Bernard Bockelbrink. We launched Sociocracy 3.0 in 2015, and we can say more about that as we go. So my background since my mid-20s, I'm 46 now, was working with at-risk young people, actually. I also worked as a therapist. I was very interested in the topics of social inclusion, relationship, and both and thinking. And so around 26 years old, I was also introduced to Sociocracy, the concept, and was invited to learn about that in the context of working with a community of people who were really struggling to have positive relationships with one another. And so that was really how I came into this whole field. It was coincidental that I learned about Sociocracy. But my main interest was how, as human beings, we can achieve our fuller potential, because the root of organization is coming together to cooperate and collaborate in order to be able to create value toward human needs. And we do that together much more effectively than we can do it alone. But at the same time, that comes with a lot of challenges, the main one just being interpersonal relationship. And so this was really the inroad I had towards human organization. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, super interesting. And now here comes a little bit of a challenge. I know explaining Sociocracy 3.0 in only a few minutes is nearly impossible, but I'll somehow want to throw you into this challenge. And second, I know you're a very humble person. You would always probably ask back, so it depends on who is the audience, whom you would be talking to. But I really want to force you this way, to say, if you can choose and say, what would you first look at, what you would include with a definition or a description, what would it be? What makes Sociocracy 3.0? What are the essential bits and pieces? How would you describe it to anyone if you could just choose?
Yeah, well, okay. Well, I've been learning for myself what S3 is as I've gone along with it. In a nutshell, my elevator pitch would be, it's a menu of human behavior patterns that have emerged through human cooperation and collaboration and have prevailed because of their usefulness in certain contexts. So a menu of behavior patterns, basically, different ways of going about dealing with different challenges and opportunities that arise in the context of human collaboration. So that's it in a nutshell. It's a bit like you might go to a particular restaurant because it offers certain flavors that would be useful for you. So S3 offers flavors that are useful in the field of human organization. You don't order everything on the menu, right? You look at what's going to suit your nutritional needs and maybe your preferences, and see if there's anything there that you can order today that would be useful. This is a very good metaphor for understanding S3.
Beautiful. Right. So there's one thing, and I love, already the notion that we started the conversation around organizational agility. I think that was one of the words in the title of our today's session. And as we know, there are many organizations out there today who try to make a difference. They try to innovate. There is this digital thing. There is this agile thing, and they apply a lot of methods and prescriptive things and recipes and anything. And still, we don't see a lot of success, or at least not dramatic success out there. So if we look at reports, there's usually this sort of transformational success rates, well, below 50%. And now we can discuss, okay, how low it would go. What do you think, if we look at organizational agility, what is actually missing if we look into organizations, into clients, into our experiences? What do we usually miss?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I come to this with the caveat of this is just my perspective based on what relatively speaking is a very limited field of experience. It's a broad question that you're asking. I think one thing I'd like to preface this with is to recognize that agility in the way we understand it might not necessarily always be required. So this idea, everything has to be agile, everyone has to be working in an agile way, is something we need to kind of with a grain of salt, because it depends a little bit on the context. But to come to your question, I think some key points that people need to know why they're working. What's the purpose of the organization? So this fits very much in the modern thinking, right? Purposeful organizations.
Right.
People need to be free and able to create value. I think this is one of the biggest challenges. Whether you're a traditional organization, you're going through some kind of agile transformation, both of them can have the effect of constraining people in ways that are unhelpful rather than enabling for them to be able to create value. So stay focused on the point of working together, which is value creation. People need to understand and or be able to learn what is valuable, and what's valuable today might be different tomorrow. And they need to have the means and the skills to produce value effectively. So you need the resources, the assets to be able to do that, but also the ability individually and together to be able to harness your co-creative potential to deliver what's required. And in a lot of cases, be able to deal with the issue of scaling as well, because obviously, you have the benefit of more resources, more people, more energy, as an organization grows, but you also have all of the challenges that come with that as well. So yeah, that would be my bullet list, I would say.
Okay. I mean, it's an interesting statement you started with, right? Not every organization needs to look after agility. And now we could discuss this, of course, and because it might be a bias we might be drawn to, right?
Yeah. And I wouldn't say, to look after agility is, life is agile, right? It's like something comes up and things adapt in relation to that. And, so in a sense, as human beings, when we're confronted by a situation that's different to what we expect to see, then we're triggered to pay attention to that and to respond in some way. And so in an organizational context, you really want to create an environment, one, where people are paying attention to whatever's needed throughout the system, in whatever area of the organization that might be. And secondly, that they are either able to respond in an effective way for themselves and or access the resources or find people who can support in order to be able to respond to that situation. So in that sense, that's what I mean by, you know, life is agile, and we navigate life in an agile way. Where we run into problems is we get stuck in our habitual ways of doing things, which makes sense while those habits serve a purpose. But, you know, in a changing world, sometimes habitual ways of doing things become obsolete or temporarily inappropriate to the context. And then you need to be able to learn how to do things differently. And I think the advantages of being in an environment with other people towards some kind of common purpose is you can harness a far broader perspective and skill set than your own. But then the challenge becomes, how do you harness that diversity of skill set and perspective in a manner that's going to be productive and enable you to respond to the needs you face? So there's a need for a big investment in learning, I would say. And perhaps one thing to wrap this up, if you look at the investment into developing agile product and service development in organizations over the last years, it's been enormous. But if you look at the amount of investment into developing agile governance, I mean, making and evolving agreements that guide decisions and activity within an organization to enable greater creation of value, this is an extremely under addressed area of organizational development. And I think that's a generic, regardless of your context, whether you're in a more complicated or complex domain, a manufacturing environment, or something like a technical environment. It's really, really important to learn how to bring that kind of agile mindset to your decision making in the system, not just from a central point of view, but throughout the whole system, so that everybody can make smart choices in an iterative and incremental way, learn through their experience, and integrate learning as they go.
Right. That's interesting, because it's interesting what the wording you use already points into, for me, points into a certain direction. But I want to make it once again a little bit, let's say, challenging or not so easy to get along with. To say, how do we see organizations? And, you know, from what I hear from you, you see organizations, you know, if we use metaphors, probably more as a living organism, right? But this is not the only view we see in theory, and where organizational, let's say, science, if we call it this way, and we might now have a discussion where organizational science started. Was it with the pyramids, when the old Egyptians were somehow organizing to get this really crazy work done? Or was it only in the past 120 years when somebody like Mr. Ford became aware of how to create products at scale? But it points at one thing. You mentioned it. People who want to understand, why would I come to work? And I think 100 years ago, well, people understood, I want to go to work in order to get this damn money. Sorry for the word. But they probably didn't really enjoy the job. They didn't really, you know, grow and personally thrive. And with this came probably this sort of understanding, hey, there is an organization, which is a structure. So there's a formal definition, which also attaches to power. And if it's about power, then we have a certain assumption which patterns, because you were mentioning patterns, are at play here. On the other hand side, what you already mentioned points a lot to learning organization. Because if many things become unstable, and we would love to have people on board, we would probably rather go for the second one. Does S3 at all anymore make this distinction between, you know, the structural definition of an organization and the usual process-oriented way of organizing things?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that is no.
No.
Because S3 has relevance across all contexts, you could say. Yeah. So in a way, it's not so helpful to make that distinction. But what is important to do, and what S3 supports, is being able to understand more about those. So the kind of formal structure, the constraints that people are operating in, but also to enable a group of people who are working together towards a common purpose to be able to do that in an effective way. Going back to your suggestion that I see organizations more as a living organism or a living system, partly that's the case. I mean, I'm not an academic. I don't come from a background, but from my observation, an organization is also an intentional construct that exists in the way it does because collectively we agree that it's so. Yeah? People might not be content with the intentional construct, but nonetheless they'll collude with it for whatever reasons they might be involved in that system. And some people will have more power to influence and will take that opportunity. So they will influence more that intentional construct, and others will be more subservient to it. So why I'm saying that is because making agreements conscious in organizational systems, like understanding why decisions have been made, why agreements are the way that they are, why people behave in the ways that they do, in consideration of the purpose of the organization, and then investing in supporting human beings to be able to make and evolve those agreements in the future to improve, optimize that system in a way that enables greater value creation, is really what S3 is supporting. So it's supporting sense making. It's inviting a focus on what works already and what doesn't work, and what could be changed, but doing all of that mindful of the reason why the system exists to start with. And I would say the last thing that's maybe a kind of bias in S3 is this presupposition that if you have people consciously choosing to invest their short, precious lifetimes into a collaborative endeavor with others, then you're going to get better results than you would from people who are somewhere because they don't really want to be there. They're not really committed or engaged. They're just there for some kind of like secondary gain.
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting question to consider for organizations. Is like, who do we have? Who really wants to be here? Why are they here? What's the purpose of the organization? What might this organization look like in the future? Were we really clear and transparent about its purpose? And also to seek to find people who are really in resonance with the purpose of that organizational system and would therefore choose to invest their time and energy into it and have the discipline required to learn and unlearn in the ways that are necessary to be able to contribute effectively.
Right. That leads me to a natural question, which probably most people might have. How would S3, and I think you can draw from tons of experience, potentially then come to life in an organization? I mean, like, is it necessary that the most powerful person in the former organization needs to trigger something and then respond to a demand in the organization, or is it possible without them, or can that be done by a little group? Or what's your experience here? What works and what doesn't? And
Yeah, so how does S3 come to life in an organization? Well, maybe the first thing to clarify is it's already alive in organizations. Because as I said at the start of this conversation, it's a menu of human behavior patterns, many of which you are going to recognize when you start digging into them and understanding them. What we did with S3 is we codified them in a way that would maybe make them explicit, because then you can be more conscious of how these behaviors are playing out in your organization already, and or in moments when an existing behavior you have or an approach you have fails to bring about the results you would expect or wish, you can kind of look to this menu of patterns for alternative options. Understanding or learning about S3 patterns isn't necessarily about learning to use them, but it also gives you this kind of it's like interface between your habits and other ways of doing things, and becoming more conscious of how you habitually do things already, because awareness is a precursor to intentional change, right? If you're not aware, then you can't interact with the thing at all. So that's an important point to make. S3 is in organizations already. S3 patterns are. But to be more specific, then, if you're looking to S3 for added value, then there needs to be a need in the organization that you're trying to respond to. So you want a problem or an opportunity the current approach fails to address in the way you would expect or wish. Another thing that's going to be really helpful is having buy-in from the top. It's good to understand who has power to influence in the system, and for them to be on board with any decision to experiment with S3 patterns. And my preference in a more hierarchical system would be that the leadership are the ones to start in response to needs that they have, that they're currently. Another thing that some S3 patterns support, so for example, clarifying domains, like clarifying areas of work and distribution of resources in the organization, helps understand where you are already. And I think that's really important, to like bring more consciousness to what you currently have, so that you can understand what works already and celebrate that. And you can identify and prioritize those areas that are going to be important to respond to.
Okay.
There needs to be a willingness to invest in learning. But there also needs to be an appreciation for the challenges and perils of unlearning, right? Because that's part of the issue. We've got generations of habitual behavior that we inherit and then play out through our unique contributions and collectively in the system. And so a willingness to unlearn some of those things when necessary and learn new things is really important, and the necessary investment to achieve that. The last thing I would say is there needs to be an ongoing commitment to learning and improvement, because otherwise things become very fast. People can easily kind of swing back to their habitual ways of doing things. You get changes of people with influence in the system who maybe turn the wheel in a different direction and so on. So staying alert and conscious across time is going to be really important as well.
Right. I don't want to dive too deep into this question or the next one, to make a difference between the Sociocratic circle method and S3. There's probably, just something where we can point people to a website and then just see what is all there. But there is another one which is quite interesting. Holacracy has been quite a thing over the past few years, and especially in the innovation and startup and what else space. What's the main difference? Because we know there is some similarity, or a lot of similarity, but what's the main difference? And you must be fed up with this question, I understand.
Well, it's more about whether to take it aside from the Sociocratic circle method, because I think it's useful to look at three variants that were built on the foundations of sociocracy. So sociocracy really was a form of government, conceived by August Comte in 1851, and it basically he anticipated that in future we would need to bring a more scientific approach to how we govern states, basically. And he also saw that it would be important to create an environment where the governed had a sense of greater participation and involvement in things that were affecting them. And so that's important to understand. Lester Frank Ward came later, and around 1880, I guess. He was a sociologist. Around 1880, he took it a step further. He said, firstly, sociocracy means rule by the social group, rather than. And secondly, he said, people in future will need to be more highly educated if we're to transform our ways of governing social systems and be more effective together. And I think that's a really important point, because if we look at agile today, it's really inviting us to learn, right? It's like, don't test your hypothesis, peer into how you continuously improve things, create short iterations where you can rapidly learn and integrate learning into what you do next. Sociocracy, the early thinkers around that were recognizing something similar, in terms of how we govern societies. So fast forward, out of that came the social circle method from the 70s with Gerard Endenberg. And then inspired by that, but also frustrated partly, I think, by it, was Brian Robertson, did Holacracy in 2007. He experimented with the Sociocratic circle method first. He found the limitations of that. One, where it could easily sway to quite an egalitarian kind of tool that leaned more towards consensus. And secondly, it didn't account for anything other than governance. And Brian was a more whole system approach to organizational development. And he was also interested in how you redistribute power in a system so all power ultimately flows towards the purpose of that system rather than getting co-opted by individuals. Whether he's succeeded with that in Holacracy another question. I'm not sure, and maybe don't understand enough about holacracy to say. But the common thing between Sociocratic circle method and holacracy is they're both, well, these days people call them frameworks, right? But arguably you could say they're a method. I would go as far as to say they're a method of methods, and the suggested approach is to adopt them wholesale into your system, and if you don't, then that's going to compromise some of the value that you get from it. So I think number one difference would be that S3 discards this notion of a prescribed method or as a way to approach things, and instead offers this optional set of patterns, which is kind of great in that you can pull in what's needed. Could be more challenging because it doesn't give you any kind of clear sort of starting point about key patterns that you should be using. Another difference I would say about holacracy was sociocracy in general kind of built on this idea of equivalence, which means that people affected by decisions are able to make and or influence those decisions on the basis of a reason to do so. So that's the scientific part coming in. It's like you need to learn how to argue for things and demonstrate the viability or the fallibility of things through argument. And the Sociocratic circle method introduced consent decision making, which basically said that in a sociocratic environment, the argument will be supreme. So it's not an individual, it's not a small group, it's not the majority. It's the argument that demonstrates how proceeding in a certain way stands in the way of you achieving your aims, or an argument that demonstrates a way to improve things. But they didn't really have a very sophisticated way of qualifying arguments. And so it could easily lean towards more kind of consensus environment. I think Brian was frustrated by this, partly. And so he developed the integrative decision-making model, which I think compromises equivalence, because you might be affected by a decision, but that doesn't mean to say that you can necessarily influence it. You can just raise a new tension. And he also compromised a bit consent, I think because it was just so difficult to qualify objections. And so he introduced a kind of checkbox model where you need to fulfill X criteria for an argument to stop a proposal becoming an agreement. One other thing I would say that's different is the necessity of roles in holacracy. So everything kind of starts with a role, and constructed in a double hierarchy structure. It's a hierarchical structure. S3 doesn't mandate that roles are necessary, can function effectively together without needing to define specific roles. It might not be a good idea to do that, but it's possible to do it. And there are many ways to structure organizations between a double-linked, rather than a double-linked hierarchy. So these, I think, would be some of the differences, I would say.
Cool. There is a lot of patterns. You mentioned it already. A couple of them you mentioned, consent decision-making. I mean, where people, I think they can just look up the site. There is an awesome site where you made all this material available for free, basically, as open source. I think that's another great differentiator amongst different methods that people just are invited to read, to maybe become interested and then grab and take it away. And then might ask somebody, because especially consent decision-making is maybe something which is also more sophisticated in terms of application. But there is one interesting thing, and I'm experienced with that because we've been not only with you learning it, actually me 2 times, to be honest, but also trying to practice and even help some of our clients with it. But there's an interesting one, because what I learned from this pattern was a lot of tensions. There's tensions, we're able to express them. And what very often comes into play is opinions. Like we're easily then getting opinions, which is fair enough, because that's what we currently feel, that's where we feel tensions. But at the same time, and that brings my question, we recognize we're bringing in S3 in a highly uncertain world, where we rather live from experiments than from biased opinions. Do you feel sometimes, if you look at practitioners, that you might just go too far? Maybe some guys even love it to have arguments and are practicing the arguing, but we never come just to the point to say, hey guys, we can pull it around but we can only go and see and learn, right? Instead of saying go via opinions. And how does that fit together? I mean, how would you find a balance in here? Have an educated dialogue, and at the same time just to say, hey guys, we can only try it and see and learn.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the many elements that Lester Frank Ward was pointing towards when he said we need a more highly educated public. Because, you know, if you're arguing for something, you need to understand the reason why you're arguing for it. Right. There's a phrase that is used both in holacracy and sociocracy, which is good enough for now and safe enough to try.
Right.
You know, so as a mindset, if you understand that many decisions you make will be wrong, in a complex environment, you can't track the relationship between cause and effect, typically speaking. And the consequence of your actions, you might be able to determine what some of them will be, but you might be surprised, and there's going to be a whole bunch of things happen besides that you couldn't have anticipated. So understanding that as a kind of foundation for coming together to make and evolve agreements about how to negotiate that kind of environment should inform people of the futility of investing too much time and energy into things. You want to have the minimal necessary constraints to enable people to be able to get out there and try stuff, and you want the minimal investment in making agreements so that you can go out there and apply your kind of hypothesis in the real world and see what the results are. So yeah, helping people understand that, I think, is really important. Another thing, though, on this topic of arguing, we're not really taught how to argue. In fact, many of us will have been taught not to argue, you know, and the consequences of arguing are often kind of detrimental to your kind of aspirations and goals. And so, you know, we need to kind of heal a bit people's experiences around that, but also understand what constructive argument looks like. You know, so there's a principle in sociocracy of consent, and consent says raise, seek out, and resolve objections to decisions and actions. And an objection that demonstrates how proceeding in a certain way will or could lead to consequences you would prefer to avoid, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve things. So if you understand that, you'll also understand that objections are gifts, because no human being in their right mind, and none of us are in our right mind on a regular basis, but no human being in their right mind would want to continue in a certain trajectory when it's going to lead to consequences you would rather avoid, or risks it, and that's a risk you don't want to take, or an argument that demonstrates a way in which you're going to get more out of your short, precious life than you will if you carry on unchanged as you are. So people need to learn this stuff. You know, it's a worldview, it's a mindset that kind of transcends wounds we might have around argument, transcends we might have around standing up and challenging authority and systems, and understanding that by deliberately inviting consent through a system, you're going to harness the fuller potential of the distributed intelligence that lies through that system in order to be able together to better respond to the needs and challenges that you face. So I think that synergy, understanding why, bringing that good enough for now, safe enough to try, is it really worth the time and effort in bringing this point up or laboring this point? At what point is it good enough we can just go on and experiment? What safety measures can we put in place to learn fast if this is going to lead to consequences that we would rather avoid? And let's evaluate regularly and stay conscious of the consequence of our actions so we can learn. Something like this as a synergy, I think, would be important.
Right.
And that takes time, because people don't get that in a half-an-hour workshop, right? Yeah. And sometimes people need to suffer enough through doing something contrary to all of that to start to understand experientially the utility of learning to do so in the future.
First of all, that sounds beautiful. And second, that immediately makes me think about, of course, we can do that in professional environments or even private lives. But what about primary education? I see nowadays a lot of Scrum guys moving towards schools, because we recognize these sort of, I call it again, patterns we can apply here. It's about collaboration, it's about learning, it's about experimenting. What kind of experiences do you have maybe moving S3 closer to kids in primary and maybe university education?
Yeah, well, I specialized for 10 years in working with young people, mainly teenagers. The particular client group I worked with was at risk of social exclusion, kids who were at risk of social exclusion. So that was either excluders, those kids who were facing exclusion from schools, maybe incarceration into some kind of pupil referral unit or so on. So this could be quite extreme behaviors. And on the other side were the school phobics, those who were anxious to engage in the social system, typically because they experienced some horrid kind of power over experience somewhere. And so they're timid to step into the social context. And so during that time, I was introducing elements of the Sociocratic circle method into that environment, working with kids. Because one way to understand a child that's facing social exclusion because of disruptive behavior, let's say, where they identify with power and disown vulnerability, and so like the bully would typically seek to make other people vulnerable so they don't have to be, right? And that's a survival strategy, if you like. But if you dig deeper, there's a reason why they're doing that, and there's often a reason why they're rebelling against the system. The problem with like the school system, I worked in the UK in the school system, is that it's pretty narrow in its scope of who it will accommodate, and it's quite implicit about its objectives. It's kind of like a filter system around who's going to conform within these like extreme constraints adequately, that we would give them reins of power to influence in the society when they're older. And that might have worked in times past more, but these days with complexity, we need human beings who can think for themselves, who can innovate, who are highly skilled, and if they're lacking skills are able to identify that and find new skills, and people who are skilled in cooperating and collaborating with others, because we can't deal with a lot of these problems alone, right? So we need each other somehow. So schools today need a new approach. So bringing reasonableness into education is something I've done for many years, including inviting teachers, for example, to think about why a kid might tell them to F off, right? To go behind their reaction to that and ask, does this kid have an argument? Are they objecting to something about the current system that, were we to consider that argument, would enable us to improve the system so that we create better results? Yeah, it's exactly the same thinking in an organizational context of adults as it is in a schooling context. So that's kind of my background thinking around it, is like enabling kids of influence and enabling people throughout school systems to harness the collective intelligence, including the contribution of people who they might previously have thought of as disruptive or unengaged somehow. But coming forward now to the modern day, so we've got EduScrum, for example. We've got John Miller's work with agile classrooms and so on. There's Aurora. No, I forget the name now. There's some really cool projects happening in the Netherlands right now, bringing agility into the learning environment. We've big problems as a species, right? It's like we've got extraordinary capacity to cause effect in the world. Our technologies have developed to quite an extraordinary level, but our capacity to kind of deal with the consequences of that in a mature way and in a way that's mindful of the impact on ourselves, each other, and the wider environment is probably lagging behind somewhat. So it's not just about educating kids; it's about everybody being more educated. Lester Frank Ward is prophetic in that sense. But when it comes to schools these days, that old approach, that traditional approach to education and kids as empty vessels that we fill up with the relevant content is way, way past. We need to encourage children's natural curiosity. We need to focus on their interests, like inquiry-based learning. So where are kids curious to learn? How do you support them to think outside of the box and plug in learning outcomes that are necessary for a child to develop into a competent adult in the context of what has their interest, and to bring this whole topic of collaboration into the schooling environment, which isn't just about helping the kids to learn to cooperate and collaborate together to achieve outcomes together, but the whole system, the governors of the schools, the parents of the schools, the teachers of the schools, and so on. And I think this is really exciting developments right now. S3 has a lot of contribution to make schooling. It's not my area of focus this year, but I'm in that conversation with people like John Miller and others to look at, over the next couple of years or so, how we can come together and start to share some of these patterns into a school environment and present them in a way that's going to be relevant and applicable in that context.
That sounds great. We're nearly at the end of our show. There's another interesting question. I'm moving forward again to those who couldn't learn it at school and now sitting in their offices, or actually not in their offices, because the new normal, and I don't like this word because it's a little bit of a buzzword, but it's the current status quo, I like to call it, just as it is, and probably it's going to continue in certain ways in this direction, that we're not sitting as an organization in similar rooms, but we're distributed. And I could pretty much imagine if organizations are already practitioners and doing well with something like S3, they probably have a lot of benefits here. But what about those who are not yet there? I mean, we probably experienced a lot of those leaders and teams who got totally confused when the hammer hits in March, for example, and suddenly people were at home. And how would people now, if they're still interested and maybe can't go back to workshop rooms and find agreements on, hey, let's do that, and go for it? What's the way to start as a virtual organization and say, yeah, we still want to do it, but we feel it's a little bit more challenging? Is it possible to do it virtually and do all of this just distributed as an organization?
So your question is it possible for organizations to sustain themselves in future as distributed systems rather than
No, it was a little bit more specific on, if we want to start S3, could we start something like S3, embark on this journey, even now that we're totally distributed and can't get together and have this conversation on site, and just do this while we are actually struggling? It's a little bit of a catch-22.
Yeah.
Is there any experience already in here to say, no problem, it works, we can do that virtually?
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, S3 patterns have applicability, many of them in a virtual and distributed context. So I won't go into the details about that now. What I've seen from my limited perspective in the world of organizations is that there's been a pretty big contraction over these last months. A lot of people have been firefighting. Their energy has gone inward into, how do we deal with this situation? How do we adapt what we've got? And it's pretty complex for most of those organizations. And so the idea of, let's go out there, find new tools, guidelines for how we would deal with this, has not been a priority in most cases. I think people were kind of, they had whatever loose change they had in their pocket when they got lost. It's like organizations that have invested more in patterns that enable a more effective collaboration, a more decentralized approach to things, and there's a kind of coherent a level of coherence of understanding about how to work together already in the system, have handled this much better. I think others have really had to firefight things with more or less success. Now, at this time, after 3 or 4 months, the dust is settling a bit. People are looking around, and on the one hand, like maybe it's not in all geographical regions so necessary to remain so fully distributed, perhaps, but still, I think the question a lot of people are asking is, why were we working together to start with, in terms of co-location, and what would be important still to handle in a co-located way in future, and what can we handle distributed? And so when it comes to S3 right now, there's been a limited number of resources available for people to be able to kind of learn about S3 for themselves. We've got the practical guide, we've got some other bits and pieces out there, but generally the bottleneck has been dependency on coming to some kind of course or having somebody come into your organization and work with you. We being Lily and I, because we work together a lot teaching, we resisted the urge to answer the few requests we had from people in organizations when all of this kicked off to offer workshops and so on for them, because we're currently working on developing self-directed e-learning programs, which kind of decant everything we've been learning over the years so people can access that for themselves. And I think this is where things are at now. The new normal, as you say, people are kind of getting to grips with where they are. If they survived till now, then they're saying, okay, what would be a more sensible way to proceed from now on? There's ambiguity around the future. We don't know if COVID's going to continue for several years to come. So that's a really important question. And we are getting now more and more requests from people in organizations saying, hey, we'd really like to look at what S3 has to offer to support us in this newly distributed way. And our wish is to be able to, as it's always been with S3, to make access to the answers to those questions as freely available to people as possible, so that they can come to those conclusions themselves, reduce dependency on trainers and experts and so on where possible, and provide learning resources that will facilitate people discovering answers to those questions. I think that's what's up next for a lot of organizations. Everybody's understanding the inadequacies of how they did things before now. That's one of the gifts that's come out of this situation. And everyone's asking, how do we, okay, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people are asking, how do we make smarter decisions in the future?
So where can people learn more about these things coming up when you talk about self-learning opportunities or any sort of different formats? Is there anything ongoing or anything in the queue, or what's your plans around that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's good to keep track on the Sociocracy30 website to subscribe there if you're not already. So Sociocracy30.org. Coming up in September, we're launching a beta version of online learning community. That's going to be with the 50 people for 3 months till December. We want to learn really about what people need. We're going to be interacting quite actively in that environment. And so come December, we're launching the full version of that. There'll be a free version. There'll be a paid version for practitioners who want to kind of go deeper and have more interaction with us and so on.
Okay.
The e-learning we're developing through Learn S3, but again, there'll be notifications of that through Sociocracy30. We've got a foundations course coming out in September around that, and then over the coming months, there'll be several more programs. And just one other thing to mention, on coming up in the next couple of months on Sociocracy30 will also be a new framework, the common sense framework, to kind of come back on that issue people face sometimes around how to get started with S3. There's 74 patterns. What do I begin with? So we've got a kind of principles-based framework that we'll be sharing up there, which I think will make a lot of sense to people, hence calling it the common sense. And also give people a way to focus on where to start looking in terms of what might be helpful for them with S3.
Okay. That's beautiful. So a lot of stuff in the queue, a lot of stuff in the making for the second half of this year, and probably everything available, as far as I understood, from different perspectives. I love this title of common sense framework, because it's hard to debate on and to say, does it make sense or not, as you just said. So it's a obviously wisely chosen name. We are at the end of our show. It's been super nice talking to you, James. So really, thank you very much for the hot seat here, definitely in your space, because again, you're at your place in Barcelona, which is obviously experiencing high season summer now. For now, I just can anybody just point anyone to your site, to your resources, maybe get in touch with all the various opportunities. I'm not sure about the conference. You had a conference planned for this year, which was about in person. Has that been postponed? All right.
Yeah, that's right. So we were to have the first S3 conference in October in the Netherlands. Yeah, that has been postponed until next year. But there will be a virtual, like a pre-conference event that's coming up in September. Once again, that will be announced through Sociocracy30 and other avenues as well. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and so well, so people could also follow me there.
Follow you there.
And yeah, and if any questions come up on the back of this conversation, just to invite people to, you're welcome to connect with me through LinkedIn.
Great.
Love to meet you. I'm happy to interact.
We'll put the pointers to your site, to your LinkedIn profile underneath on our YouTube channel. So anybody who wants to continue following us and see what's coming up next, just subscribe. For now, thanks a lot, James. You joined us today, and yeah, stay safe these days, because we know Barcelona has been hit, Spain has been hit, everywhere. It's still moving, a lot of challenging times. Please continue this great work, and we're just looking forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to you too for putting on this and the other calls. I see you've been having some great conversations, so I would encourage people to check those out as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.